Natalia, sit. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us here at this side event held in the Grand Hall of Arctic Frontiers. Thank you for helping us fill the room, and we look forward to your questions and input. This side event is titled Russia Talks, Arctic Narratives and Arctic Influence. And as we know from those of us who have come to Arctic Frontiers for many years, the character has changed. Russia remains a large part of the Arctic territory, yet is not here at these events due to the country's reinvasion and war against Ukraine. So we're left with an analytical puzzle, and we look at that today, trying to understand or analyze how Russia's objectives and interests and practices in the Arctic have changed, both within their own domestic Arctic, but also in practices towards other countries. And that includes everything from kind of strategic narratives to hybrid threats and events. So today we're going to tackle none less than the questions of how do we interpret Russia? How do we interpret the foreign policy? What are influence campaigns? How do we make the connection between narratives and actions and threats and analyze them and separate them from one another? We have an excellent panel today, and I'll just introduce briefly in the order that they'll be speaking. We have NUPI senior researcher Dr. Natalia Muen, who will tell us a bit about Russia's Arctic narratives and how they've changed since 2022. We have Professor Kari Myklebust from the University of Tromsø, professor of history and also co-arranger of this event. Thomas Nilsson, many of you know as the editor of the Barents Observer, which was recently rewarded a wonderful prize, the Sundsby Prize. And finally, last but not least, my other NUPI colleague, research professor Jakub Godsumirski, who will walk us through a kind of a comparative approach to how some of the things we observe in the Arctic from Russia may also be evident in other marine areas. Okay, so how we're going to do this is we're going to open with some brief. Each speaker has some time to present some knowledge, information, perspectives, and then we will open up for questions with you and a panel discussion. So Natalia, with no further ado, can you lead us into these Arctic narratives and their change?
Thank you, Lana. So in this presentation, I will give you some insights into how Arctic is portrayed in Russian media before and after 2022. And this is based on my analysis of Russian domestic newspapers and also Russia's news supplier for foreign audiences, Russia Today, or RT, as they rebranded themselves as. So first of all, it is important to mention that none of these sources are particularly focused on the Arctic in their coverage. For example, RT only mentioned the Arctic in around 40 stories in the periods of 6 months in 2024. So, in other words, the news stories I have examined are aimed at general domestic and international audiences with no special interest in the Arctic. So, these narratives can be interpreted as a kind of mainstream narratives in a Russian context. So, I will start with the domestic narratives. So, the majority of the coverage in the domestic newspaper that I have investigated, Российская газета, it is called. So after the full-scale invasion in 2022, it was, and before also, it was dedicated to domestic issues, such as regional development and ecology. We did not find any increased attention to questions of security or foreign threats after February 2022. Quite the opposite, actually. We found that the discussion of the war was silenced. And yet the changing international situation did seep into the discussions with a particular focus on challenges and also opportunities presented by Western sanctions. So these sanctions, they were presented as hostile actions by unfriendly countries with the reasons for the sanctions unmentioned. So basically, so-called unfriendly states, including Norway, were blamed for the sanctions and for distortion of cooperation with Russia in the Arctic. However, the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine and that was the reason for the sanctions, it was not unaddressed. It was unaddressed in the media. So another issue that was silenced in this newspaper was the pause in the Arctic Council in 2022. So apart from these issues, we found a continuation of trends in the coverage that have been established by other researchers. So there was much focus on the development of the Northern Sea route as an important strategic goal for Russia. The topic of climate change appeared quite frequently. And the dominant position on climate change in that newspaper was that it was a threat to the Arctic and to the world in general. However, the potential benefits of climate change were also addressed. For example, warmer temperature would increase potential of a longer period of use of the Northern Sea route. And a final important part of the coverage that I will mention here is oil and gas. So for Russia, the energy sector is an important industry that influences the development of the entire Arctic region. And the challenges presented by climate changes was in this coverage effectively decoupled from the questions about fossil fuel extraction. So we found no arguments about limiting oil and gas extraction to counteract the climate change. So moving on to RT. I have explored the coverage of the Arctic in RT between July and November last year, 2024. And non-surprisingly, the stories were primarily concerned with international relations and security. And consistent with finding from other research, the Arctic was portrayed as a region for both cooperation and rivalry between various states. So the rivalry was between the West, often presented as the US and NATO, and Russia. However, there was one article that mentioned Arctic Council as an arena for negotiation and cooperation with the West, where that negotiation was still possible. So the Arctic was also presented as an arena for cooperation between Russia and friendly states. Significant attention in summer 2024 was, for example, given to India as a partner in multiple areas, including Arctic shipping and energy. So relatively high number of such stories was probably triggered by the visit of India's Prime Minister to Russia in July this year. And similarly with domestic newspaper, RT also highlights sanctions as a power tool used by the West against Russia in an attempt to hinder Russia's cooperation with friendly states, such as India and China. So, in other words, in RT, the Arctic is viewed as an area of strategic and economic significance for many states. In the context of security in the Arctic, the focus in RT was on threats from the West, also represented as NATO and the US, military exercises, and the Northern Fleet. And just to mention the Nordic states, there is not much focus on the Nordics in RT's Arctic coverage. And in all cases, these states are presented as part of a larger whole, primarily as a NATO states. So, but they mention membership in the Arctic Council is mentioned in one article, as I said. And all in all, I find that Norway, Sweden, and Finland were primarily positioned as part of NATO, and thus as part of a collective rival for Russia in the Arctic, while Iceland and Denmark, on the other hand, they were not. They were only mentioned as part of Arctic Council. So I guess this indicates that at least then, up until November, these states played a smaller role in Russia's geopolitical thinking about the Arctic. So just to sum up, I will present four trends. The first one is continuity. So apart from the attentions to sanctions, we have not found any drastic change in Russian domestic newspapers' Arctic coverage after a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I think this is in line with Russian state media in general. It was important in 2022, at least, to make it seem as the war in Ukraine was not affecting other areas of importance for Russia. So the newspapers, the state newspapers, they were tasked with keeping appearances of business as usual. The second trend is climate change. It was accepted as an important issue, although this does not determine policy for Russia. For example, the domestic newspaper coverage indicates that the development of oil and gas sectors is more important policy priority. The fourth trend is security. In RT, the news outlet aimed at international audience, focus on security dominates. So in this context, Norway, Finland, and Sweden are presented as unfriendly states to Russia. By contrast, the domestic newspaper aimed at Russian readers in Russia downplayed Arctic security as a topic. And the final trend I will highlight is international cooperation, and the way cooperation with Western and non-Western actors has been addressed. So before February 2022, the Arctic Council was depicted as an arena of cooperation with the West. The Arctic in general was viewed as an area of cooperation with Russia, between Russia and other states. And after the full-scale invasion, neither the Arctic Council nor other areas of Russia-West cooperation received much attention. While non-Western countries, in particular India and China, have consistently been categorized as partners. And after the invasion, they were rebranded into friendly countries as opposed to unfriendly Western countries. So these were my main points, and I'm looking forward for your questions afterwards.
Thank you, Natalia. I would like to just ask one, because it was a great presentation, and I think the point that really stuck with me at the end was also, how to interpret these media narratives that you've identified so well as a reflection of Russian policy. That you seem that there is a gap, noting that some of the focus on continuity might be about addressing that's how they want it to seem for Russian society. I know you've worked so much on this. I kind of wonder what do you think we need to know about how to use media as a source of proxy data for understanding Russia?
Okay, so I think Russian media, state media, is very interesting research. It gives interesting information of how, what stories, I guess, are spread in Russia, and how, because many Russians read these newspapers, so we have to assume that some of these stories are also representing a more general view. At the same time, it is important to read, to access different sources. So here I presented state media. I presented Russia Today, which is like a strategic information. I guess it's strategic. I don't want to use the word weapon because I don't like that word, information weapon. But I guess it's like a tool to influence foreign audiences, right? To give Russia's positions to foreign audiences, while the government newspapers can be analyzed as tools that can influence opinions inside of Russia, and they can explain to us why some Russians believe in certain things, like why is there support for the war in Russia. And I think the media and the propaganda that is spread within Russia through state media is one important tool, influence tool, that has impacts on popular opinion. At the same time, it's also important to broaden the sources, so to broaden the corpus of the sources that we analyze. So there is much media, Russian language media, which is not financed by the state, and so there are many sources where researchers can go to access the variety of Russian discourses and narratives, because the narratives I have presented to you come from like a Russian state position. And it's important to mention that there are other stories which can be accessed through other sources.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. And that really gives us a sense of both strategic narratives oriented towards domestic audiences and towards international audiences, such as us. I realize I never introduced myself, but I know that hopefully all by process of elimination have understood my name is Alana Wilson-Rove, and I work at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and the Norwegian University of the Life Sciences. So with that, we'll go over to Kari, who will continue our exploration and also bring us both the general level and also over to Svalbard.
Yes, thank you, Alana. And I'll just start by saying also thank you to Natalia for a very interesting and thorough sort of reading of the Russian press. I'll start with 2 comments to sort of supply what you have been looking at, because if we look at statements from top Russian Arctic officials, a more targeted picture appears, I would say, because what we have heard from Nikolai Karchunov, from Chekunkov, from the big Russian top officials in Arctic policies over the last 2.5 years, in particular concerning Russia in the Arctic Council, is a very clear messaging. They say, 1, Russia is not just one of the 8 Arctic states. Russia is the Arctic state, the Arctic great power, and it is so because the Arctic is a region naturally dominated by and belonging to Russia, because Russia has a big part of the Arctic, as we all know, half of the Arctic coast. And secondly, they also emphasize very much that Russia is the only responsible Arctic player, responsible in the sense of social issues, economically and environmentally, and that the Western decision to put Russia on the sideline in the Arctic Council or to marginalize Russia will decrease in increasing tensions, problems that will have highly negative consequences for the Western Arctic states. So Russia has been highly concerned of not being closed out from the Arctic Council, and we heard this again last week from Maria Zakharova, who the Kremlin spokesperson, who said that trust and cooperation in the Arctic and Russia in the Arctic Council in full again will only be possible if the Western countries abandon their anti-Russian policies and express a readiness to respect Russian interests. So a rather hostile rhetoric coming from the top Russian officials, I would say. Then over to Svalbard, which is my main topic for today, Russian narratives on Svalbard. And I will talk on, I'm a historian, I will talk on how history has been instrumentalized on Svalbard since the full-scale invasion to serve Russian presence and interests on Svalbard. And I'll say also a few sentences on who the main recipients of these narratives are, because it's not only us. This is very much directed at the Russian home audience. And a main point, narratives of the past in Russian politics is a very, and has become under Putin, an integral element of Russian foreign and security policies. They are political acts. When Putin and other Russian top politicians talk about the past, they are doing politics. When it comes to Svalbard, Russia's narratives have not changed fundamentally, I would say, since the full-scale invasion, but they have definitely intensified, and new powerful elements have been added to underline the main message from Russia concerning Svalbard, which is the same message as during the Cold War, mainly, that Russian presence, Russian economic activity on Svalbard extends way back in time, and that for historical reasons, Russia holds a special position on Svalbard. Basically, even if Russia respects the Svalbard Treaty, Russia's presence and rights are founded on historical presence, which some Russian studies, archaeological studies, for example, would say outdate every other state, including Norway. So over the last few years, we have witnessed a growing promotion of this Russian historical presence on Svalbard, applying symbols and narratives from the Soviet period and also from the pre-Soviet period. We have seen look-alike marine parades in Svalbard waters on Russian Navy Day. We have seen victory parades on the Russian Victory Day, May 9, in Barentsburg and in Pyramiden, also applying military-like symbols in uniforms and flags. We have seen, and now we are back in pre-Soviet times, we've seen a Russian bishop, Bishop Yakov of Messene and Naryan-Mar, who in August 2023 sprinkled holy water on a newly erected giant Russian Orthodox cross, which was decorated with a St. George ribbon, and he was also sparkling holy water from a balcony over Pyramiden, and stating, which is one of the 2 Russian settlements in Svalbard, and stating that this is the rebirth of the settlement of Pyramiden. He did a lot of other things also when he was in Svalbard, and I can get back to that. But this use of history to promote Russian presence, to argue that Russia has historical presence in Svalbard, and to evoke this history through symbols was very much continued and enlarged during last year. In March 2024, Arctic Ogol, the Russian coal mining company, state mining company in Barentsburg, celebrated that Barentsburg was allegedly 100 years old, through exhibitions, to lectures, both on Svalbard and in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Arkhangelsk, Murmansk. Street signs with Russian names have been put up both in Barentsburg and in Pyramiden for the first time as part of the celebrations. And this was disseminated very actively in the home to the Russian home audience through social media channels with names like Spitsbergen, Closer Than You Think. And then we had the May 9 Immortal Regiment Parade in Pyramiden last year, where they also invented a new monument for the occasion, so they needed a monument to parade up to. And Bishop Yakov came back to Barentsburg last summer, where there is now also a priest for the first time and regular Russian Orthodox services. And then lastly, we have this simultaneously last summer, a very abrupt increase in the use of Soviet flags in the 2 Russian settlements, including the raising of a giant Soviet flag at the top of the mountain Pyramiden, with similar statements that this is an old tradition which has been revived and will live, revitalizing Russia on Svalbard. So how could we interpret all this new activity over the last few years? Well, first of all, this is not entirely unique for Svalbard. We have Immortal Regiment Parades, acts held on May 9 in several Russian-speaking communities around the world, from South America to Asia, and also in Russia-occupied Ukraine. And to put it simply, this is a way of disseminating Russian foreign policy narratives by way of symbols, narratives that evoke ideas of Russian greatness, that push historical revanchism, I would say, and neo-imperialism in the Russian population. So to a Russian audience, the Victory Day parades on Svalbard, where also separatist flags from Donbass were applied, they state to the Russian home audience that Russia's actions in Ukraine are legitimate. It underpins the narrative that Russia is allegedly in Ukraine just supporting the rights of suppressed Russian-speaking minorities, and that the enemy and aggressor in Ukraine is the so-called neo-Nazi regime in Kyiv. So what we are witnessing is the Kremlin mobilizing Soviet symbols, narratives as very powerful identity-building tools in their own population. And of course, by doing this on Svalbard, the Russian authorities are also revitalizing Svalbard in the home audience. And at the same time, and this is my last point, these narratives and symbols are also very much directed at Norway and the wider NATO community, the application, I would say, of military symbols in the Russian parades on Svalbard is a way to test Norwegian reactions. The erection of a Russian Orthodox cross in Pyramiden is also the same. It's a strategy aiming to provoke a reaction from Norway. The cross was put up without permission from the governor in Svalbard, on purpose, very much so. So this is a way of provoking a reaction from Norway that could potentially be used as a pretext for escalating the situation and still blaming Norway for escalation. So I think I'll stop there. I could also say more on this when we go on in the discussion, but the very last point is that these acts on Svalbard are accompanied by anti-Western messaging in Russian media, again coming from Russian top Arctic officials that alternate, so they're dual in a way, they alternate between emphasizing the Arctic as a zone of peace, Russia as a keeper of international law, including on Svalbard, and on the other hand, this very assertive narrative of Russia's special position and historical rights on Svalbard, and also statements claiming that Norway is subject to American Arctic colonialism in Svalbard affairs. So a very dual message.
Thank you so much, Kari. And I feel like from your presentation, I certainly appreciated how some of the activities taking place in the Arctic, in this case on Svalbard, have to do with broader trends within Russia. You're pointing about the foreign policy greatness and so on, but also some of them are very much directed towards kind of specific, Norway specifically, or Svalbard politics in and of itself. I wondered, and I hate to ask, it might be too difficult to do, but just given how international our audience is, if you could introduce just a little bit about, if someone in the audience is wondering, so both Norway and everyone's living on Svalbard. What's going on there? Could you give us a tiny 101?
Right. So Svalbard is part of the Kingdom of Norway. It's under Norwegian sovereignty. But the Svalbard Treaty from 1920, in the aftermath of World War I, which gave the sovereignty to Norway, also states that every signatory state to the treaty has the right to equal economic activities on Svalbard. So it's an open archipelago in an economic sense. The history has made it so that the only two states that actually have economic activity on Svalbard is Norway and Russia. The economic activity has developed from mining coal to tourism and science, mainly. First for Norway, and now Russia is sort of coming after. And I could pick up in our discussion later on how Russia, I would say, is instrumentalizing both the tourism industry and also science on Svalbard to enlarge its presence in a sort of way that reminds us of hybrid threats and a sort of politicized activity that is not mainly or only about tourism or education and science, but it's also about the wider Russian presence.
Interesting. Thank you for that, and we can return to that topic. We know a lot of the actors here today also are involved in science on Svalbard, so it's an issue I think that we'll want to talk more about. Over to you, Thomas, to continue the conversation here.
Thank you, Helena. I think that for us in the media, it is quite crucial that we from time to time take one step back when we are trying to debug disinformation, propaganda, and false narratives of what's going on in the north. And news are developing as we are speaking. Just before we came to this room this morning, the Kola Peninsula was once again under attack of Ukrainian drones. It has been a massive drone attack towards northwest Russia this morning. And of course, Ukraine, as such, has good reasons to do so. They are defending themselves. A lot of those bombers that are launching cruise missiles against civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, energy infrastructure, the children's hospital in Kyiv last summer, and so on, are coming from the Kola Peninsula. So they have all legitimate rights to hit back. But this makes the military units on the Kola Peninsula nervous, and we have to put that into context when we are trying to understand why the Kremlin are putting forward those narratives that they do in regards to Norway, in regards to NATO, up north inside the Arctic Circle. And the Northern Fleet has, in a very substantial way, changed its military exercises in Norwegian exclusive economic zone since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. From before 2022, exercising all the way down to the North Sea, especially outside the Lofoten Islands, the Andøya area, and west of North Cape, till after February 2022, when we see that all live shooting exercises takes place east of the North Cape, meaning the Barents Sea, which the Russian Northern Fleet consider as its home water. This is clear because the ballistic missile submarines are based on the Kola Peninsula. Their operational area are the eastern Barents Sea and the waters north of Novaya Zemlya and Franz Josef Land into the Arctic Ocean. So for Russia to protect this one. And here we are back to Svalbard, and to understand why we get these stories about the area in just between the sailing routes from the shallow Barents Sea into the much deeper Norwegian Sea. There you have a line from Spitsbergen down to the Bear Island and further down to the North Cape. The one who controls that area will control much of the Barents Sea. It gives Russia access to the deeper Norwegian Sea, where they can disturb the transatlantic routes, meaning the reinforcement of not only Norway, but also crucial for Sweden and Finland nowadays. And it is the one who controls that line that can stop NATO submarines from entering what Russia considers as its home waters. So when we, 2 years ago, me and Kari, we were lucky to be on board one of the University of Tromsø's vessels sailing out of Tromsø, together with the Standing Committee on Defense and Foreign Affairs in the Norwegian Parliament on our way north. We was just north of the coastline here before the first telegram channels in Russia, social media in Russia, came up with a unique fantasy history. Presenting that the Norwegian Parliament had entered a secret agreement with Pentagon. This was approved in the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defense of a grant of $100 million to build a secret biolab facility at, and you guess where? Of course, at the Bear Island, where we were heading. It might seem crazy, but you know which world we are living in. You know that we have this, let's call it the Flat Earth Society, this 2% of the population in European democratic countries that will actually ask the question, are we sure that Norway have not entered such an agreement on the Bear Island? No, we can't be sure. We haven't been there. We haven't seen it. We haven't seen any proofs. Those 2% of the population is very important. But at the same time, the main receiver of such message are the population on the Kola Peninsula, in the Russian north. It gives them a narrative to understand that, first of all, Norway is very closely tied up with NATO, and that Norway is hostile towards Russia, and that we are using our Arctic so-called civilian infrastructure for military purposes. You all know that there is only a meteorological station at the Bear Island. By the way, this biolab laboratory on the Bear Island will develop viruses that are targeting the Russian genetics in the Arctic. This is the narrative, and it spreads like normal from the social media channels up to the local newspapers, entering national federal newspapers, and by the end of the day, we read about it in RIA Novosti, Interfax, and national news agencies in the north. And I've been working with Russia as a journalist for so long time that I do not longer believe in coincidences in time. So Norwegian Standing Committee is sailing up there, and this comes out in Russia. A few months later, the same story appears again, this time in a conference in Murmansk, a science conference arranged by Russia's National Geographical Society, by the way, a partner to this conference here in Tromsø, Arctic Frontiers, a few years back. This Russian Geographical Society had invited scientists that are specialists on the genetics of Russian populations in the Arctic to give a lecture, half an hour, about this biolab laboratory on the Bear Island. And again, there is no such thing as a coincidence in time, because what happened in the very same time? The US ambassador to Norway visited Longyearbyen. This is one way to understand why Russia is doing what they are doing. And they are just in many ways copying stories we know from before. You have heard the story before. Some 2 decades back, when the United States attacked Iraq, bioweapon laboratories, installations, facilities for production of weapons of mass destruction. And we have also heard it one place also before, 3 years ago, just up front of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. One of the main reasons presented in Russian media, in the Russian narratives, were that the United States had several, both radiological and biological laboratories in Donetsk, in Lugansk, on the Crimean Peninsula, and that is used for legitimizing the attack. And these very paragraphs you can today read about in the history books in the schools in Murmansk, with slides of the location of these areas. So for Russia, it is both to provide questions inside this certain amount of population in Europe, but it is also targeting their own population. And this is happening as we are speaking. It's a very, very important part. Again, the Barents Observer, we that are running a hub for Russian exiled journalists and with Norwegian journalists that for many years have been traveling in northwest Russia, debugging false narratives and so on is becoming more and more difficult. But, and believe me, it's becoming more and more important. Media's role in this world, and especially up in the Arctic, where the Iron Curtain is coming again, not only physically, but also in the information sphere, is crucial. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Really interesting and important lines you're drawing here. I wanted to ask, in some ways it seems, like you say, it's a coincidence in time, but it also seems like an oblique measure. Like it's, is the idea of talking about this false narrative of a bio lab on Bear Island, is it a way of just introducing into the population of the Kola Peninsula, who have been part of this Barents cooperation for many decades, which with the idea of promoting the notion of friendship across borders or similarity, is it to promote a sense of Norway as an enemy, basically, or is it just more of a put as many false stories out as you can and distract people from what's really going on?
Kremlin narratives have one big challenge, and that is that the Murmansk region is probably the region in Russia where the largest percentage of the population have been traveling abroad. They have been to Finland, they have been to Norway, and they know that there ain't lined up hundreds of NATO troops on the border ready to attack. So they are, of course, it's difficult for the Kremlin to provide such narratives, but not impossible. So they try to do it. And we have seen it over many, many years. It was back in 2014 when Sergei Lavrov visited Kirkenes, when he first time started to see that it's not actually Norway that is the big enemy here, but Norway, what is that? That's a puppet state of either Washington, D.C. or Brussels, that we don't have our own foreign policy and so on. So by that, Lavrov and the narratives are circumnavigating the question about Norway, because Norway, we don't have our own will, etc. And Lavrov repeated some of those statements when he was here in Tromsø by the end of 2021, just a few months before the full-scale invasion.
Very interesting to think that the outcome of all the efforts in region building makes these populations a particular target for these sorts of efforts, but long before the re-invasion of Ukraine.
Yes, it has been going on for a decade. Yeah. It's just that we on the Norwegian side haven't necessarily seen it, or didn't want to see it, or read it. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think we're heading towards, I'm very much looking forward to your questions as we have our last speaker now, who will bring us into more of a comparative perspective, which I think is great for us, especially the true Arctic nerds here and in the audience at Arctic Frontiers. It's also so helpful to get that global perspective. Over to you, Jakob.
Thank you for being invited. Thank you for sharing with us all those important nitty-gritty insights about the Russian narratives and use of information space to spread information that is not always right. I think that in order to understand what is happening, in order to understand what kind of narratives are being promoted in Russia, we need to, and before I go to present this more comparative examination, we need to understand what kind of regime we have to do with. This is a personalistic, authoritarian, autocratic regime that organizes, for instance, meetings with leading journalists to tell them what they are going to present in the media they control or they somehow work together with. So the issue of narratives in Russia needs to be understood in the broader context of the understanding of the current Russian regime. And then, before I will move to this more comparative study, we need also to understand what this regime is most interested and most preoccupied with. And I think that if we were to present a very short list of the interests this regime has been pursuing since at least Putin's return in 2012, we must most probably agree that there are two of those objectives. One is to stability and the survival of the regime itself. This is a regime that is very much interested in securing its future, and this issue of stability and survival is also something that drives Russian production of those narratives that we have been talking about, because those narratives are to serve this specific purpose. It is about influencing the Russian broader audience in order to make them think twice before launching any color or not color revolution in Russia. And we have seen that the huge portion of the Russian society has been pacified to a very large extent, become less active politically and do not mix into, do not interfere in the big politics. The other objective this regime is most probably pursuing is the idea of returning Russia's just place as a great power other great powers have to reckon with. And this brings me to this comparative examination of Russia's interests in the four regions that I was asked to look into. We have been talking a lot about Russia's interests and stories about the Arctic, and we see that this issue of Russia being confronted in the Arctic by the ugly West, the ugly collective West, led by the regime in Washington, is very high on the agenda, although it's not the dominant narrative on the Arctic, as Natalia has told us. But still, we need to understand that from the Russian perspective, Arctic is important because this is an area where Russia can and will play a major part in if the conflict is to escalate, because as Thomas has rightly mentioned, Russia has its most important strategic assets located in the Arctic, in the Barents region, and this means that the Arctic is very important from the Russian perspective in both cases, because it's about the survival and the stability of the regime, not least because, for instance, most of the Russian energy resources are located also in the Arctic and in the close areas, and those resources are used in order to somehow buy the support of the Russian population to the regime. So this is this kind of less obvious dimension, but it's also about those strategic military assets that Russia treats as its most important instrument of deterrence, because the fleet in the Northern Fleet, located mostly in the Murmansk area, is the second strike capability fleet that is somehow to deter any type of Western aggression against Russia in the Arctic, but also elsewhere. And this elsewhere is also very important, because we know that the war in Ukraine that was launched or relaunched, as Elena puts it, in 2022, has also had some huge implications for Russia's position as a great power and in various regions. And the Barents region is definitely something that is important from the Russian strategic point of view for reasons related to the second strike capability. Although Barents region is much less discussed in Russia, in Russian media and in the Russian public and political narrative, because Barents that we define as the High North is on a part of the border region that is Russian Arctic. So we need to understand that Barents is on the part of the Arctic and has no separate place on the Russian strategic map. Then if we move to the south, then there is the Baltic. Baltic used to be an area where Russia met two types of countries after at least 2004, when the Baltic republics joined NATO. It was about Russia meeting NATO, but it was also about Russia meeting neutral countries like Finland and Sweden, and also Russia was meeting the EU in the Baltic. After the launch of the Russian operation in Ukraine, two of those neutral countries, Finland and Sweden, decided to join NATO. This has changed the strategic parameters of the region in a very decisive way. So the Baltic is important, but Baltic does not have this strategic place in Russian strategic thinking, while the Arctic is something that is going to play a major part in the event of a major confrontation. The Baltic is mostly about settling disputes, regional issues, finding ways of living with the new enlarged NATO in the region. It's not about kind of Russia's long-term strategic interests. And then, if we were to move further south to the Black Sea region, we see that this is a region where Russia decided to employ its military instruments of power in order to somehow do something that would secure Russia's return as a great power. The operation that was launched on the 24th of February 2022 was to be a kind of surgical operation that was to remove the sitting Ukrainian political elite, replace them with a pro-Russian leader, and this would also result in Ukraine returning to under Russian control. Now we are 3 years after the launching of this operation that was to secure Russia's return as a great power to be recognized, to be reckoned with by other great powers, and 3 years after this operation, the situation is still very unclear. And now Russia is facing also a huge challenge, because they don't know how to relate to this new American administration. And this brings me to some conclusions that we know from history that Russia prefers to have to build its relations with other states on the bilateral basis. And there are some countries that are very much present both in the Arctic but also in other parts of the three regions that are viewed by the Russian political decision makers as the most important ones. When we look at the Arctic is definitely an area where Russia is very much interested in its relations with the United States, because United States is an important player globally, but also in the Arctic. It's also about Russia viewing its relationship with the US as something that confirms this return of Russia as a great power. The United States is most probably the only country, maybe except for China, that Russia feels to be on a pair. This has something to do with history. Russia used to be one of the superpowers of the Cold War era. Then Russia has suffered a lot of challenges, has faced a lot of challenges over the past years. And then there are also some other countries. In the Black Sea region, for instance, Russia's relations with Turkey are also have been serving Russia's return as a great power. Russia competed for influence in the Middle East with Turkey, but at the same time, and this is another important element, having to do with the personalistic regime, we need to also focus on those persons that shape. And we know that, for instance, Putin has a very good personal relationship with Erdogan, and this also, to a very large extent, informs Russian policy towards the Black Sea. So I think that it's important to have in mind that those four regions that I have been talking about, the Arctic, the Barents, the Arctic, the Barents, the Baltic Sea, and the Black Sea, what Russia is doing there and what kind of stories the official Russian media are telling about those regions is a function of those two interests, the security and stability of the regime, but in these four regions it's also very much about Russia's wish to be recognized as a great power.
Thank you so much, Jakub. That was a wonderful, a very good kind of tour around kind of all edges of the Russian state. I wanted to ask you, because it's, I think it's given how much we, hear about as, we follow the news and so on, that of kind of incidences, tensions, et cetera, in the Baltic Sea. It is interesting. I wonder if you could explain again why, to see that the Arctic, where thus far, we've seen exercising, there's, concern for could provocations or accidents somehow escalate, but we haven't yet seen expressions of the same level of conflict or sabotage or accusations of sabotage as in the Baltic Sea. Could you walk us through that one more time? I think it's a really important point.
I think that one issue that we also need to understand is the Russian approach to conflict and war. We know, and this is well documented by various types of analysis that have been published over the past 10 years and also in a longer historical perspective, that Russia's approach to conflict is based on the idea of not having clear distinctions between peace and war. And the hybrid warfare that there is a lot of talk about, the political warfare that is another name for the same type of activity, is also something that is located in between. We need to understand that when talking about relations with Russia, we must talk not only about full-scale war and full-time peace, it's also about competition and various types of confrontations. And this hybrid type of activity is something that has been used by Russia even before the launching of the full-scale war against Ukraine in 2022. We know that Russia, for instance, has been using its energy resources in order to influence the policies of other countries. We know also that this propaganda machine that is now being used in order to influence opinion both in Russia but also in other parts of the world has been developed since at least 2012, when Putin came back to power, and fearing of a kind of color revolution, Russian decision makers have placed much more attention on the issue of how to deal with information-related challenges. And so this information warfare is something that we have seen the emergence after the Russian annexation of Crimea, and this has also become a much more important element of this relationship between Russia and the outside world. It's about influencing the domestic politics. Russian politics is sometimes described as the fight between the refrigerator and the TV screen, and propaganda is definitely something that serves to increase the level of stability of the regime by influencing public opinion in Russia. But on the other hand, those information-related tools are also very much and very often used in order to try at least to influence public opinion in other parts of the world in order to sow the split and weaken the Western society's resilience against this type of activities.
And I guess that brings us back to where we started with also thinking about, the role of Russia today in external signaling. I have we are open to questions. We have this dramatic lighting and a smoke machine back here, so we can't really see you very well in the audience. But do raise your hand, and if you need to wave the flashlight on your phone to get our attention, there's also someone going up and down. Let's take a question from the audience. Then I have a few in my back pocket as well. Right up here in front, second row. And please do introduce yourself.
Hi, Lana. Thanks. Shannon Jenkins from the U.S. I have a question for you regarding the fact that Norway, the U.S. both share maritime borders with Russia. Finland shares a land border with Russia. How are these countries, or could these countries, be managing or balancing cooperation, competition, and security? Or how should the three countries maybe be collaborating on balancing those factors?
May I?
Do you want to jump in, Jakob?
Yes.
And then
I think that you have asked a very important question. We know that Russian activity is a kind of, to a very large extent, a trans-border activity, and we have seen at least two examples where the countries in the region have been exposed to various elements of what could be termed as Russian hybrid warfare. In 2015, Norway experienced the inflow of 6,000 forced or not forced migrants to the Russian-Norwegian border, and over the past couple of years, Finland has also been experiencing this similar type of challenge. So this means that there is a need for coordination of policy when it comes to dealing with Russia at the regional level, but what is even more important is that we need to coordinate this policy in the two institutions that all the three countries are members, not all the three countries are members of, because Norway is not a full-fledged member of the European Union, but having in mind that NATO and the European Union are increasingly working together on addressing those issues, we must also convey the message not only to the local authorities but also to those two important Brussels-located institutions that the countries in the region face challenges that other countries in Europe have also been facing, and this increases the need for having a more coordinated approach to this Russian challenge on various levels.
great. Yeah,
Just adding a few lines to the question about information warfare and disinformation and propaganda. Finland is ahead of us. When Prigozhin established his troll factory in St. Petersburg, it targeted specifically Finnish media and Finnish journalists, long time before this disinformation campaign started towards Norway. And when it started towards Norway up in the Arctic, it was maybe especially to the Barents Cooperation and what's happening in the border areas where we are located. So for me, as a journalist in Norway that lives and are based in the only town where we drive directly west to get to Finland, we learned a lot by cooperating with our colleagues in Finnish media. And that I have ever since said that if we are really going to build resilience in Norway towards to stand against the disinformation and propaganda and narratives of the Kremlin, well, let's jump into the bus and we go on a study tour to Finland. So that's one way that we could learn. And the other way to your question is, of course, that Norway, as a founding member of NATO, have much more on the strategic military side that Finland could learn from how we have been dealing with being neighbor to nuclear power superstate before the breakup of the Soviet Union and in post-Soviet times.
We're going to turn to Kari, and I also wanted to prep and plant an extension of this question. I was interested, Natalia, in a minute, if you could tell us a bit, like, does Russia, or in the media that you've looked at, see Norway as separate from Finland, or are they all kind of put together as the unfriendly countries? And I also thought we could maybe pick up on the issue of, that in many of your presentations, you give several examples of kind of misinformation, kind of unfriendly rhetoric about Norway or other countries happening, not since 2022, but, years before. And something about why was our kind of alertness or awareness of this type of informational campaign? Was there a strong alertness to it or not? And why might that be? But let's hear what you have in response to Shannon's question before we turn to those.
Yeah, Jakob he came by the example that I wanted to draw up on the targeting of the Norwegian border with Russia in 2015 and the parallel to the targeting of the long Finland border, NATO border to Russia. So this is a very clear example of how we in retrospect can understand, when seeing Finland today, what was happening on the Norwegian border in 2015. And then to Thomas, we could go even further. We should go on a study trip to the Baltics and to Ukraine, because they know this very assertive, very negative, very multi-layered side of Russian warfare. And how to deal with it. The Ukraine has its own little army of information specialists who know how to debug Russian narratives, and who have witnessed over years how narratives are accompanied by acts, violent acts, hostile acts. So I think we have a lot to learn. Also from the Baltics, from Poland and from Ukraine, when it comes to debugging Russian narratives and Russian hostile acts, which are below the surface of direct military conflict, but which are hostile, even if they seem to be incidental or, not what they actually are.
We risk not viewing them as part of a strategy of kind of everything, everywhere, all at once.
We risk not recognizing them, but we have neighboring states in the Baltic and around the Baltic Sea who are very good at this.
Good point. Did you want to jump in on
Norway?
Yeah,
Finland? Yes. So I was just looking at my memo that I wrote about Russia Today coverage, and as mentioned, there are not many articles that spoke of the Nordic countries in general, but Norway was mentioned the most out of all. But both Finland and Norway were mentioned as NATO states. But I think one important contextual factor is the year of this study, right? It was in 2024. So I think perhaps if I did research earlier on, I think those images have changed. Like the way Norway is represented in Russian media has changed. And other studies have actually mapped how Norway increasingly has been addressed as a NATO member, like not being a mind of its own, kind of, but like following NATO lines in their policies towards Russia. So there are studies that have documented that development. So I just want to just read one short quote from Russia Today of how so like in an article that just mentions Norway, they have to contextualize Norway, and then they write like Norway is one of the founding members of NATO and borders Russia in the Arctic. So instead of just saying Norway blah blah, they say like Norway is one of the founding members of NATO, which is like maybe so this is the way this planting of narratives work. So like as a subtext to position Norway in a certain way in an article that's maybe about something completely different and is not about NATO at all. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And it really does also, I'll turn to you in a minute, Jakob, and just want to introduce this as a theme to move on to. For example, in the Norway-Russia relationship for a long time. I remember in 2022 at the Kirkenes conference is sort of the last time we really heard Norway, say, neighbors in the north, this kind of very important post-Cold War, our own narrative about things in common due to Arctic relations. And maybe we'll turn back to that and think of, what has become of that? Will we expect to see this again? But Jakob, you wanted to weigh in.
I wanted only to jump in to say a few words about the Russian strategic perception of Norway, Finland, and Sweden. When preparing for this presentation, I looked into how many articles are tagged with as related to Finland, Norway, and Sweden on the official websites of the Russian president and of the official website of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And Finland is tagged 128 times on the official website of the Russian president, Norway 28 times, and Sweden 10 times. On the official website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Finland is tagged 468 times, Norway 385 times, and Sweden 417. Comparatively, I can mention that US is tagged 280 times on the official website of the Russian president and 4,721 times on the official website of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This really shows you somehow this represents a sort of strategic imagination of the Russian decision-making community, because this really somehow tells you about the strategic hierarchy that Russia operates on, in a way.
Oh, that's very interesting data. Natalia?
Before I forget, just one quick thought. I'm also doing research on Norway's narratives, media narratives on Russia, and our narratives have changed as well on how we represent Russia from this more cooperative, or not even cooperation maybe, but there were other things in focus, but it's been more and more securitized on our side as well. So of course we can't compare Russian media with Norwegian media, but if we're thinking of cultural narratives, then they are very much complementary in this antagonistic relationship. So we also position Russia as an antagonist, right? The way they position us as an antagonist.
Any other questions? We have another one here in the front. I'm afraid I'm only seeing people in the front, but.
Hello, my name is Svanhild, and I'm the leader of Yata Tromsø, which is we're interested in foreign policies, safety politics, and whatever. And I was just wondering, we're growing up, I was really engaged in youth politics when I was younger, right? And then we had this close contact with Russia, and we met Russians, and we had first-hand experience with them, and a lot of cooperations. And now there's none of that, so we don't really have any experiences that are first-hand anymore. So I'm kind of wondering, what are your thoughts about the society having information about Russia only second-hand, because we're not able to travel there, we're not able to talk to people, so it's only second-hand. So kind of what are the consequences of this, and how do you see the future in terms of actually first-hand experiences with Russians or Russia?
Thank you. It's an excellent question. We'll go Kari, and then Natalia, and then Thomas, because in the order I saw your hands.
Yeah. Thank you. Very important question. This is our big frustration, of course. I myself have been working very closely with Russian colleagues all through my career for 2 decades. And in writing Russian history, writing various periods of Norwegian-Russian historical relations. And I think it's a very important part of writing legitimate history about Russia, working together with Russian colleagues. Unfortunately, we cannot do that any longer. Russia is securitized on another level. I mean, you can talk about Norwegian narratives about Russia being securitized as well, but Norway still has a free public sphere in another way than... Russia is a total different level, and it's not... Thomas can say more on this, of course, but it's not safe for regular Russian citizens to talk to me, for example, anymore, if I were to travel to Russia. They could be interrogated or even imprisoned for giving out for being accused of giving out information to foreigners. So very frustrating. I think one of the solutions lies in what Thomas and his newsroom is doing, with working with Russian journalists in exile. And at UIT, our institution, we try also to cooperate with European universities, European institutions who have Russian exile research environments and who are establishing educational programs about Russia and also in Russian for students, Russian students in Europe in exile and Russian researchers. So I think we have to make the most of what we can, working with the Russians who are here, who have the same convictions as us about a free public sphere, democratic rights. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Since Thomas was mentioned in the last comment, we'll go Thomas in the back to
Yeah, you're very right. You know, journalism is about telling the story on site, meeting the people where they live, telling what is their challenges in life. And when we cannot go longer to Arkhangelsk or to Murmansk or Narya Mar and the other places in the Russian city, we have to find other ways to get first-hand information. So by building what we have done in the Barents Observer is having a small hub of journalists that want to do their job but would be writing themselves into prison if they did that job in their newsroom at home. So together with local old good contacts in Northwest Russia, we have the Arctic Hub of exiled journalism. And we are, again, working very closely with some of the hundreds of other exiled Russian journalists that you find in the Baltics, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Georgia. And so on. And we have also been on a workshop together with the Nordic Center of Journalism from Aarhus in Denmark, trying to see how exiled Belarus journalists could team up in this way. And, you know, from September 2022, when Putin announced his partial mobilization, it's about 900,000 Russian citizens that left the country and are living in Europe today. And they are our main bridge to get first-hand information from home. So we have the resources and we have the ways of communication, although difficult. What I will call on Norway and other countries to do is to maintain the knowledge that you described by all these thousands of Norwegians that have been traveling in labor unions, at schools, in environmental work, in universities and so on. All those that have been there, seen it and have contacts, and to maintain that. Unfortunately, the Norwegian government is having this as a saying. Norway have good expertise, but at the same time are cutting dramatically in the budgets to those institutions and organizations, NGOs, universities that are working to maintain the knowledge that we have spent 30 years on building up since the end of the Cold War until 2022, when the Iron Curtain came back.
Mm-hmm. Great point on also capacity and knowledge in terms of those networks. Natalia, did you want to weigh in on the media environment? Or?
Yes, I think many important factors have been already addressed by my colleagues here. And I think your question is spot on because when you don't meet the people on the other side of the divide, then you get this enemy image is kind of growing and growing because you are not really in touch with that other person. And in that sense, I think Norwegian media has a responsibility here, and not the Barents Observer because you're doing a great job, but other Norwegian medias who are very much focused on what Putin is thinking. Right? What Putin is thinking, what Putin is doing, that's the only thing we read on in some of the big media in Norway. Well, there are so many stories that are not covered, so many issues inside Russia that you can access through, like if you follow social media, if you talk to Russian exiles, if you talk to Russian journalists, then you can find out about like different things going on in Russian society. What happens when you protest, for instance, the war, or what happens, what have happened with like policy inside Russia, like many things. Like what are Russians going through today? Actually, like what is going on in Russian schools? What is going on with Russian people? Right? What we don't know. And I think it's important for Russian media, for Norwegian media, to focus on those stories as well, and not only on focusing on the Kremlin and what Putin's friends are saying about Ukraine.
Right. Do you mean that in a sense, like, do you think it would be more positive, or you're just saying it would be a more complete picture of the changes happening in Russia? Because I think Norwegians are very concerned about what the Kremlin is thinking, because they would like to wish, most Norwegian citizens would wish the war in Ukraine to end, with Russia to withdraw their troops. Yeah. So it directs a strong attention there.
Yes.
But do you think we risk understanding how this war is transforming Russian society? That we won't know what country or people we're meeting. Is that
well? You answered your own questions. I don't know why. But I think I understand why the focus is on Putin, but there is only so much we can know about what's going on in his head, right? But we can actually trace developments in Russian society and figure out what kind of Russia are we dealing with right now. What are like the I don't know, if you just focus on, for instance, like how patriotic education is going on in schools, and what kind of Russians they're prepping for the future, for instance. That is an important topic that we could study. Like, what kind of Russia will we see? Like, focus more on the people. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Excellent point. There was a question, I believe, in the front. Still have it? Wonderful. I'll take a quick look around for hands.
My name is Rasmus Ravn. I'm the Arctic editor for Altinget, the news site out of Copenhagen. I have two questions. Just briefly, if it's mentioned at all, the joint Russo-Chinese exercises in the Arctic, are they mentioned at all in Russian media, and how are they being sold? You know, given that we have, like, my prime minister, for instance, is now very, she likes to speak about the North Korean, Russian, Chinese axis that we're seeing currently. And then on collaborations between scientists, do you see any openings for this coming up in the Arctic Council now that some of the work among work groups, not on the political level, has resumed? We know this is threatening, potentially IPCC reports in the future and so on. Thank you.
Great. Sharing, I could kick off with sharing a few thoughts. I don't know how it's been covered in the media, but obviously the Russia-China convergence is of great interest for the Arctic, and especially I think, the notion, you saw it was very strongly highlighted in the U.S. Arctic strategy from the Department of Defense, these kind of joint exercises and in the Bering Sea. And I guess I was trying to think, Thomas, probably the Coast Guard agreement is maybe one of the moments that kind of triggered some attempt between Russia and China and the Coast Guard. And then maybe let's do Russia-China first, and then come back to collaboration on scientists. Anyone with a Russia-China perspective?
Yeah, I can't answer broadly, but what we see, for example, I follow several of the Russian higher education institutions that I've been cooperating with. I still follow them through their web pages and their social media channels. And what I see is what I would interpret as a very opportunistic mode. They very much promote cooperation with Chinese delegations, with Indian delegations. They are very concerned to show officially that they are striving to fulfill this pivot towards the east, and the south, which the Kremlin's foreign policy newest document, for example, states that this is the direction that Russia is now heading. So we see how Russian universities are very actively inviting Chinese delegations, inviting various Southeast Asian delegations, Indian delegations for new collaborative efforts, Belarusian delegations, of course. So in this sense, yes, it's very highly promoted by institutions themselves. I couldn't say anything about the more general media picture, but Natalia perhaps can fill in.
Yeah, I did. I wrote a research paper on Russia-China in that domestic newspaper that I have mentioned earlier on. So we didn't find much on China, but what we did find is that out of all the articles about the Arctic in the period between 2008 and 2023, which we have data on, so it's like 15 years. So United States was the only state mentioned more than China. So basically China was on second place after United States. But it was not, when I went in depth on those articles, they were not so much about Russia-China cooperation in security sphere, but more like China's rivalry with other countries like United States. So this is what I have data on. I think everyone who is trying to find this China, not everyone, maybe I can generalize to everyone in the world, but I many people who have tried to find and establish this cooperation between Russia and China has not really found much in the media. That's what I can say. That there is not much data on it.
It's not a very domestically not a celebrated relationship or highly profiled.
Not at all.
Oh, it's I think that's a really interesting.
But also
point.
in Russia today, but also in Russia today, in that 6 months, I found India was more in focus than China, for instance. So, yeah.
What we see from Russian media up in the north is that it's very important for local authorities, regional authorities, the different institutions to tell the story in media that Russia is not isolated. I mean, Russia is out of the Arctic Council, but Russia have new partners. And China plays that role in many sense. So, but China is also important for us in media to be aware of. China is a clickbait, of course. China, Arctic, Russia. Wow, who don't want to read that? But let's take a short look at the Coast Guard cooperation, which got quite big headlines both in Norway and Russia. They visited Murmansk, but they were with 3 people in uniform. Not a Coast Guard vessel, not any kind of weaponry. Russian Coast Guard is not the military. Russian Coast Guard is FSB. So, and they were there as inspectors. So when we read in international media that FSB Coast Guard and the Chinese Coast Guard is teaming up for joint exercises in the Arctic, this time in Murmansk, well, it was not. It was 3 inspectors on a kind of simulated exercise inside the Kola Bay, a few hundred meters from the port of Murmansk. Okay, we might call it Arctic or not, in the very same way as those exercises that took place last year in close to the Bering Strait, when also at that time China sailed a Coast Guard vessel up north. But was it really Arctic? I mean, very far away from ice-covered water, at least. So it comes with a responsibility to be editors and writing about these issues.
Right, and I'll just weigh in briefly on the kind of Arctic Council question in point. That we have, Russia is in the Arctic Council. It was announced on this date. I remember just kind of Foreign Minister Huitfeldt announcing it, kind of at Arctic Frontiers, that Norway would seek to resume the Arctic Council with all 8 Arctic countries on board. And so what you see is, as you were mentioning, the political level is, activity is minimal. And then you do have the working group levels, and I think we've had a lot of good sessions more zeroed in on the working group, so I don't think we have to go into detail here, but it does probably vary to some extent, the level. But I would just raise again Kari's point about kind of broader scientific cooperation is with Russian scientists living in Russia is fraught with risks for both sides, also for those who might wish to, in Norway, for example, there's still an opening for individual collaborations if one should wish, but the risks that are involved, particularly also for the Russian counterpart, really shouldn't be underestimated. And I also would like to say that I think this interesting point, I think it was you who mentioned India, or that the kind of pattern of partners is shifting when Russia's chairship, which the other Arctic states paused their cooperation in the Arctic Council while Russia had the chairmanship. But Russia kind of continued in the same way as what you noticed on the university sites, and you were talking about profiling other partners. So they sort of ran their Arctic Council chairship within the country, not with other Arctic states, but inviting kind of, India, China, Dubai, United Arab Emirates, and so on, to participate in various events. And I think we also see that some of what's important, and I think a big question for all of us, is how, while we might look at narratives like these become practices, are they things that actually happen, actions and issues, and they also become macroeconomic realities that I just read recently. It was just a recent article in The Economist that showed that India, for example, their import of Russian oil has increased from very little to, now it's 40% of their oil imports are coming from Russia, and a dramatic increase over a year or two. So these things are also solidifying in ways that it's not, sometimes we think, oh, speech is easy, but these narratives and then the practices and the economic changes that support them are not like flipping a switch to change back. Jakob?
The relationship between Russia and China is very complex. It's sometimes referred as a marriage of convenience, but it's also love and hate dimension there, and there is also love and concern dimension there, because China is definitely taking Russia's historical place as one of the two superpowers that are going to shape the world of the future, and the partnership is very asymmetric in a way. Elena mentioned those macroeconomic dimension, and we know that the Chinese economy is growing rapidly and is already 10 times bigger than the Russian one, and demographically it's also quite of a challenge, and then there is this kind of Russia becoming much more dependent on support provided by China in order to survive as this great power. So it's also a very complex situation.
Well, we are out of time. I would please thank you, audience, for wonderful questions and listening. Feel free to come up and say hello if you have a further question or a comment. And just please join me in thanking, of course, the wonderful technical crew and organizers here at Arctic Frontiers, and as well as our panelists for a great discussion. Thank you. Thank you.